Good morning. I'm Pastor Ryan, and I'm just so glad that everybody could be here today. And how many of you have heard the phrase, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade? That's something that we've heard, that it's a really common phrase. And James, we're going to be in James chapter 5 today, and James kind of has a lot to say about that same idea, that life's going to be hard. Life's going to give us lemons. There are going to be things that we go through in life that we're going to struggle. Some of them are because we're human, and so we're going to experience sickness and disease because we're humans and we're imperfect. But some of it's also going to come from spiritual warfare. And then also some of it is going to be God testing our faith and helping us grow and mature. But James tells us that when we can have a good attitude, that when we face these trials and tribulation, when things are tough, we can have a joyful attitude, and we can grow in our faith, and we can have all of this because of who God is. But to do it, we need 4 things. We need to make sure our heart is in the right place, and we can do that in 4 different ways. We can do it by having a joyful attitude. We can do it by having an understanding mind, having a surrendered will, and having a heart that believes. And James is saying that we can do all of this because of God and who He is and what He's done for us. So we're going to be in James chapter 5, but we're going to start in James chapter 1, verse 2. And there we go. And James wrote, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." James said, consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds. And it's important to note that James said it's important when you face trials of many kinds, not if you face trials. Because life is going to be tough. There are going to be things in life that are difficult that we're going to have to navigate as we're going through them. And James is saying that when that happens, have that joyful attitude. And he says this because outlook determines outcome, and attitude determines actions. And so when we have an outlook and an attitude that's joyful, then the outcome is going to be, we're going to understand how that outcome is going to work for our good. We're going to see how we're maturing and growing through the trials and through the tough circumstances in life. And it's also important to note that James, in verse 1, said that he's writing to God's scattered people. He's not writing to God's sheltered people. James is writing to the Christians that were scattered throughout the Roman Empire. He was writing to Christians that didn't have a common country, a common language. And it's important to note that he's writing to the scattered people, not the sheltered people. Because God never promised that life was going to be easy. But He did promise that He's going to be there and help us through it and give us the strength to endure so that we can have that joyful attitude. And he also points out that he uses the term fall into, or when you encounter, but that's not an accident. He doesn't mean to suggest that when we fall into trials or when we encounter them, it's not just like some chance meeting. It's God working everything for our good. God knows ahead of time what's going to happen. And so He's preparing us to grow and get closer to Him. And one analogy that works really well for this is the back of a loom. When somebody's there weaving a beautiful tapestry or rug, when you look at and can only see the backside, everything looks like a mess. Everything looks unorganized and out of place. And when we're here on earth, that's what we see. We see the backside. We see the mess that's happening. But James is writing to encourage us because God sees the front side, and he's weaving the front side. And so he knows what he's doing. And so while it looks like a mess to us, God is in control and is weaving it for our good to build something beautiful out of us. And so James is writing to encourage us to have that joyful attitude and to help us remember that God knows what he's doing. He sees the whole picture. And so James continued in verse 3. And James wrote that we should consider it pure joy because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And so we ask, how can we have that joyful attitude and consider it joy when we face trials? And James tells us that it's because we need to understand that those trials help produce perseverance. But then how do these trials help produce perseverance? How can we benefit from them? The first way is that faith is always tested. Faith is always tested. When God called Abraham to live by faith, God tested Abraham's faith. God told Abraham and promised him that he would make him a father of many people and father of a nation, and that his descendants would outnumber the stars in the sky. And then, so he has his firstborn son, Isaac, or his secondborn son, Isaac. And God says that it's through Isaac that he would produce the nations. And so God then tests Abraham's faith and says, take him up onto the mountain and offer him as a sacrifice to me. And so Abraham goes, he takes Isaac up on the mountain, and he's ready to sacrifice Isaac, his son, not understanding how God is going to turn this into a nation. But God stops him and lets Abraham know that God was just testing his faith. So faith is always tested. And after the experience, we realize that our faith is stronger. Our faith in God grows when it's tested and when we're forced to put our trust and our faith in him. It's tested and it's stronger. And the second way is that testing works for us, not against us. God didn't tell Abraham to take Isaac up to the mountain to torture him. He did it to test him, and he did it for Abraham's own good. Paul wrote in Romans 8:28 that all things work for good for those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. That God has a plan, and he wants what's best for us. And so everything that happens in our life, God can use to work for our good. And a great example of this is Joseph. Joseph was born and had brothers, and his brothers hated him because he was dad's favorite, and so they sold him into slavery. And then after he was sold into slavery, he was falsely accused and thrown in prison, and then forgot about in prison. And for Joseph, it seemed like everything was going wrong, but he stayed true and continued to praise God through all of it. And when everything seemed to be going wrong, it turns out that God was using those terrible things that happened to get Joseph right where he needed him, so that he could interpret Pharaoh's dream and be placed in charge of Egypt and saving Egypt, where his brothers then came during the famine and were saved as well. And one of the last things in this book of Genesis, in chapter 50, Joseph is talking to his brothers. And they're scared that Joseph is going to be angry at them and take revenge. But he tells them that you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. He says that what you intended for evil, God intended for good. That's being done, the saving of many lives. So testing works for us, not against us, because God is always in control. He knows what's best for us, and he wants what's best for us. And then the third way that we can have that joyful attitude is to understand that trials rightly used to help us mature. God, he wants what's best for us, but sometimes we're the ones that are getting in our own way. Sometimes we're the ones that are too immature to do what God wants us to do. And so God tests us, puts us through these trials so that we can mature and grow, so we can produce that perseverance we need to endure, so we can produce patience and endurance, and so we can produce the ability to keep going when things are tough. Because God knows what's best for us, and he wants what's best for us. And so sometimes God allows us to go through trials so that we can test our faith and rely on him, but so that he can help work in us and change us so that we can be who he wants us to be, so we can grow and be more like him. And then in chapter 1, verse 4 and verse 12, James says that we know that faith produces perseverance, and let that perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. James tells us and assures us that God is testing and working for us. He's working in us, and he's working for us. But God won't build our character without our cooperation. And sometimes going through trials is how he gets our cooperation, how we learn to turn to him and to rely on him rather than our own strength or our own understanding. Because God works for us, he works in us, and he works through us. See, God works for us, and he did that on the cross. Because God knew that there's no way that we could save ourselves, and so he did the work for us. And he sent his son to die and rise again so that we can be with him forever. And God works in us, and that's what we're talking about today, is God working in us, maturing us to make us more like him. He's sanctifying us. And that's what that word means. It's just God working in our lives to clean us out and make us more like him. And one of the ways he does that is through trials and testing. And so God's goal for our lives is maturity, because God worked for us, and then he works in us, but he works in us so that he can work through us. Because one of the marks of a mature Christian is lived out service to others. Not looking out for our own needs, but looking out for the needs of others. And James was writing all this, and he said, consider it pure joy. Make sure your heart is in the right place. And he also said that we're going to need patience. See, James was still addressing the Christians that were suffering. And when he was addressing them, he wrote, be patient. Because we must patiently endure the hardships and the heartaches until Jesus returns. Because until Jesus comes back, there's going to be hardship in our life. There's going to be things that we have to go through that God's going to test us. God's going to work in us, put us through trials that we can grow more like him. But there's also things that are going to happen because we're human. because we're not perfect and we're going to mess up, and sometimes we're going to put ourselves in those tough situations. But God promised that he's always going to be there for us, and that he's always going to give us the strength to rely on him. And so in James 5:7-9, James connects the idea of having joy in trials and having the patience to endure. And so James wrote, "Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door." James was talking about patience and how we need patience to endure the trials that God is going to put us through so that he can work in us and through us. And he used the example of a farmer. Because if somebody doesn't have patience, they probably aren't going to make a good farmer. Because farmers have to be patient because they can't control what happens. They can plant the seed and make sure that it has the right environment to grow, but they can't make it grow. Farmers can't control the weather, so they have to be patient and wait for the rains. But waiting patient doesn't mean sitting around and doing nothing. Because while farmers can't control the weather, they're still doing a lot of work to make sure that everything is ready for when the time is right for the seeds to start growing. And the farmer spends so much time waiting for the seed to grow and for it to produce its yield, to produce a crop. And James used the Christian and created the picture of the Christian being a spiritual farmer looking for a spiritual harvest. How, as a Christian, we have to be patient and endure the trials that God is putting us through so that we can grow in him and grow closer to him. But after we endure the trials and have patience and grow, we will produce fruit. We'll produce fruit that'll look like us showing love to those around us. It'll look like us being more like Jesus. That's what it will look like. That's what the fruit looks like that God is producing in us. And so we must be patient. And we must wait and let God work in us. And we must allow him to work in us and be patient so that he can grow the fruit. So that he can produce the fruit in us. Because the farmer, again, as he's waiting for his crop to grow, that doesn't mean sitting around doing nothing. That means a lot of hard work and patience. So then in verse 10, James writes that, "Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord." So the first example that James used to show patience in enduring trials was the farmer. And the second one was the prophets. See, the Christians that he was writing to that were scattered, they would have had a large Jewish influence, and they would have understood who James was referencing when he talked about the prophets and how they needed patience to endure the trials. For one important reason is that they were in the will of God, but they still suffered. And the prophet Isaiah is a good example of this. When Isaiah encounters God, and God asks him, "Who will go?" And Isaiah says, "Send me. Here am I, send me." And then God told him where he was going. And God told Isaiah that he would go to a people who weren't going to listen. that he would go and God told him it would be like a stump, that the fruit that Isaiah was planting and the people that he was sharing God's message with wouldn't listen and wouldn't turn. And Isaiah suffered because of it. God called him to do something tough, to do something hard. But Isaiah was obedient, and he went, and he suffered because he was doing the will of God. And James used the analogy of the prophets to show that we need to have that same patience that Isaiah had, the same patience that the prophet Jeremiah had, to endure suffering, to do the will of God. But the prophets also encourage us by reminding us that God takes care of us. Because while things were tough and while the prophets were suffering, God was there with them. And he helped them endure, and he took care of them. And so the example that James used about the prophets should encourage us to spend more time in the Bible, to get more acquainted with the people who knew God, who were with him, and walked alongside him. To spend more time to get to know who God is. Because that's how the prophets endured. It was because they knew God and they relied on him. And then James finished this idea in chapter 5, verses 11 through 12. He said, "As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear by heaven or by earth or anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned." James finished here pointing out the sufferings that Job endured. And Job was a rich man in the Bible. He had everything, but then he lost everything. And his friends and his wife and the people around him were telling him to just curse God and die. But Job refused. As he was experiencing the trials and the loss of everything, he refused to curse God. And after he endured, God restored everything that he lost. And so when do those blessings come? Well, James taught us that the blessing comes after we've endured. And that doesn't mean that we're going to be like Job and suddenly get back everything that we lost. But it does mean that after we're patient and after we've endured, God will grow that fruit in us. And we will experience God's blessing in our life, that we'll be able to feel God's presence and know him better, and walk closer with him. And there was an idea in ancient Israel that because they thought that if you experienced blessing, they thought that meant that God's blessing would be shown in those earthly ways, in the way of wealth or power. But the book of Job refutes that idea, because Job showed that even though he was never out of God's will, and he had everything, so they thought that meant God's blessing, but then he lost everything, but he was still in God's will, and he was still close to God. So the blessing doesn't always look the way we expect it to look. But God does promise that those blessings are coming. And one thing that as we're waiting for the blessing, that we have to remember is that Satan wants us to get impatient with God. Satan wants us to put things on our own schedule and our own timeline and be impatient with God. But God says, be patient because my grace is sufficient. And that's the bottom line for today, is that God's grace is sufficient. Because it's by the grace of God that the trials work for us, not against us. It's by the grace of God that everything works for our good. It's by the grace of God that we can have the patience to endure the trials. And the example of this is Paul. He writes that he was given a thorn in his flesh. We're not told what that was. And when Paul asked God to take it away, God replied and said, "My grace is sufficient." And then James finished with verse 12, saying that don't take oaths. Don't make promises by anything of heaven or on earth. And that sounds like kind of a left turn, like kind of a weird thing to say after, like, have patience to endure trials. Oh, also don't take oaths. But we're all human. We've all experienced trials and hardship. And it's really easy to start making promises that we know we can't keep. Start taking oaths to do anything to relieve the pain. And so James put this in there to remind us that don't do that. Have patience and wait on God, because God's grace is sufficient. And this is a good reminder of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, when he says that anything more than a simple yes or no is from the devil. And so James was writing to show us how, but also to encourage us that as we face trials of many kinds, to have patience, to rely on God, because his grace is sufficient.